Hey y'all, my name is Ann Wyatt. I started my career in workforce development with the state of Kentucky in 2010. That experience ignited a deep passion for manufacturing within me. I started this show hoping to raise more awareness around the bright outlook manufacturing careers have. Join me as I sit down with some of the manufacturing industry's most successful changemakers and learn how they're partnering people with technology. It's time to give people more meaningful work. This is Workforce 4.0. I am so stoked and honored to have our guest, Michael Patrick Perry, with us on Workforce 4.0. Michael is the Vice President of Marketing for Dexterity. First of all, he's amazing. And secondly, he's excited to talk about all things workforce and how technology is helping giving people more meaningful work. So, Michael, do you want to introduce yourself just really quickly to our audience here?
Yeah, thank you, Ann. And wow, what a pleasure it is to be here on the Workforce Wednesday chat. Very eager to chat with you and the community about what we're doing in robotics and automation. So we were just talking about this before we started rolling, but my background has really ranged the gamut for different types of robots. Currently at Dexterity, the company that I work at now, we handle robots that can grasp and interact with things in a way that typical robots and automation couldn't do before. But before that, I worked at Boston Dynamics, where we worked on walking robots, deploying robots in complicated, unstructured environments where wheeled and tracked robots couldn't go before. And before that, I worked at DJI, which is the world's largest drone manufacturer. So getting robotics into the sky and making it accessible for people and changing the way that they do work. So I've gotten a chance to look at a variety of robots and have seen the transformative power that they can have in different industries.
That's amazing. Yes, I know when the show up for today, our friend Chris Lukey made sure to comment that you knew a lot about drones too. So we've got to give you a little bit of space here later in the episode to talk a little bit more about that as well. If
Absolutely.
you're joining us live, I just want to remind you, get in the comments section. So without further ado, it's just kind of been a tradition at this point for me to ask all of my guests here on the show what their go-to karaoke song is, or if you don't have a go-to karaoke song, what your favorite song is. And Michael, I just want to ask, do you mind to share that with us?
No problem. So, keeping with the theme of today's discussion, I wanted to do something robotic related. Like typically, most of the karaoke songs that I sing in real life are very like one octave, very little modulation in notes. But for today's discussion, I figured we should do Daft Punk one more time. I know they've had later hits, but that's the song that I jammed to when I was growing up. And I think we could belt it out and have a good time with the crowd, particularly those of us who love robots.
I love that. Yes, that is so awesome. Yes, that's a good one too. I'm gonna have to go play that a little later because I could use that energy
Oh,
to
yeah.
today. So awesome. Great deal. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Sure. What's your song? I does anybody ever ask you that?
No one asks me that. No.
Ah, well, there you go.
Are you
What's
asking me my favorite
Yeah,
karaoke?
what's your karaoke song?
Well, I did an event in Charlotte a couple of months ago and we all went out for karaoke. And I started with Alanis Morissette, All I Really Want,
Okay.
which is a good one.
So I
But,
think you can actually sing.
well, I try. I
Okay.
try. So, yeah.
Sure.
I do my hardest. But I'm thinking about adding Raise Your Glass by Pink to my
Oh,
karaoke list.
man, you're bold. I don't have the pipes for that, but I would be cheering you on.
Yeah, well, I figured it's a good karaoke song, right?
For
Gets the
sure.
people going for sure. I know you're amped to talk more about robotics, and I'm amped to learn more. So we'll get into kind of the
depth of our conversation here. But you've worked for some amazing companies within your career. I know you mentioned Boston Dynamics and now you're with Dexterity. Can you tell us what you find most exciting about working in the robotics industry and why you are so passionate about this industry?
Yeah, it's one of those things where the first thing that got me really excited about working in robotics, working with DJI in the drone space, was that you got to be outside. I love being outside. I love being in the physical world. And as I've gone from robots that fly to robots that walk to robots that grasp things, getting to physically interact with the real world as a part of my job, it sounds totally obvious to people that make things, but in the technology space, particularly here in the US, that's not always the case. So you get to push the envelope of what's possible while being face to face with the thing that's being made, like whether it's the robot or the impact that the robot's having on the physical world. So I'd say, in terms of the pleasure that one has working in robotics, that's got to be the number one thing. It's just being able to physically interact with things. But then taking a step back and saying, what's happening in this industry, robotics is at an interesting transition point where previously robotics was very inaccessible to people. It was, something that was either in the lab or in, very expensive industries that could afford high-end expensive robots, whether that's military and defense or auto manufacturing. We're now at this inflection point where the cost of compute and GPUs and various sensors like GPS and vision cameras and so on and so forth are getting cheaper and cheaper, that the intelligence for robotics is becoming accessible to a lot more people than ever before. So with that brings people's creativity. In the drone space, we saw people using drones to fly into volcanoes to collect data that was previously impossible to do, so they could learn more about the world. With Spot, the walking robot from Boston Dynamics, I was so lucky to see the robot be deployed in nuclear fusion reactors and deployed at Chernobyl, and even be a performance, part of a performance in a clown show. And now with Dexterity, there's this urgent need for adding automation to brownfield warehouses. Where we were talking about this before, where you've got this massive scaling of warehousing and manufacturing, but you don't always have the people that are there that are required to do all of the complicated work that you expect a person to do. And this next generation of robotics is now enabling people to think creatively about how automation can step in and supplant and expand their capabilities in these sectors. So, not to sound like a tech optimist, super fanboy, but the sky really is the limit for this next generation of robotics.
Yeah, I think that's what's so interesting about robotics and industrial automation right now is, it is very much like the Wild West, so to speak, if you want to compare it to that, but it's like very innovative space, right? There's where in manufacturing there's always been standards and there's been process for so long, and now we're really getting a chance to exactly be creative
Yeah.
and design new machinery that performs new functions and helps us out. And then you think about the ability to access robotics now.
Hmm.
Who doesn't love the Roombas, right? So it's
Yeah.
like become a intangible and now it's in your house.
Hmm.
Excellent, excellent stuff. Thank you so much for that. We do have our first comment here. I'm assuming this is from Carol, because LinkedIn does this to me too. Um, but she's here. She says the best question asked in the history of Workforce 4.0. I think she's talking about the karaoke comment. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, Carol, if you could clarify for that. on that for us. But um, yeah, excellent. Good stuff. So when you're thinking about some of these exciting technologies and coming from the robotic space and all of this creativity and all of this innovation, my optimistic viewpoint is that I'm hoping to see, how machinery such as industrial robotics and automation is going to help our human workforce, right? That's my vision for Workforce 4.0. But how do you see these technologies helping to give people more meaningful work, as we like to say?
Yeah, absolutely. In the automation space, and particularly in robotics, always talk about the three Ds: dull, dirty, dangerous. And within that context, automation is really picking up these tasks that are incredibly repetitive, whether they're doing rounds and readings, where you're just walking around looking at gauges and marking them down on a chart or inputting them into an iPad. It's not really the cognitive, it doesn't benefit from like the cognitive complexity that people have and can be, again, fairly rote work. In dexterity, where we're looking at solving some of the most complicated, literally backbreaking work in a warehouse, whether it's palletizing and depalletizing or singulating and inducting, where you're just standing at the bottom of a chute flipping packages onto a conveyor belt. It's doesn't really benefit from all of the different things that our creativity, our complexity, our passion really can provide in a warehouse or a supply chain context. So within that, automation really is supplanting a lot of that stuff that people kind of come to the table and say, I hate this part of my job the most. And that's typically where automation immediately flows to, is the part that's causing repetitive stress injuries or seeing the highest turnover in jobs, because just candidly, people don't want to do them.
Yeah, and that lends itself to, while this robot, right, is doing more repetitive tasks that people don't necessarily want to do because we are people. We are passionate, we are creative, we are all these things, right, that make us uniquely human. Um, then, that frees your human workforce up to provide that need for people
Yeah.
in your workforce. But I have a video that you sent me, and I'd like to show it to our audience today. I think it kind of gives a great visual on some of these intangibles that we're talking about. Is it okay if I go ahead and show that?
Yes, please.
It's about a 30-second clip here, so let's just take a look. Very cool. Can you give us a little bit of a breakdown of what we just watched there, Michael?
Absolutely. So Dexterity is a company that was founded in 2017, and our mission is to make repetition optional in work. So a lot of the repetitive behaviors that people have to do in their jobs is as we spoke about, is not cognitively complex and can be physically dangerous for people. So Dexterity is adding intelligence to commodity robot arms so that they can handle the complexity and dynamic environments that typically are bad for robots to be successful in. Traditional robots really need precision, where you have a very known size and weight. in an environment that's very pristine, that the robot understands, and it's programmed to do a very specific task over and over again. The real world is not like that, where you have a wide variety of material that's presented to the robot or presented to the person that's doing a task. The person has to respond to the thing that's presented to them and still get the job done. So we built this platform of all of these layers of intelligence where the robot's sensing and touching and thinking and problem solving on the fly, so that it can do a wide variety of the things that you saw in that video, which includes taking a random shoot of poly bags and corrugate boxes and bowling balls and all of this different stuff and singulating it onto a tray. We showed also in there palletizing, where you have Huggies and Gatorade and dog food that's being presented to a robot randomly, and it has to figure out how to stack all of those things and create a stable pallet. That's where the robots are starting to get this full sense of intelligence that you would expect a person to have in doing this job. It's not really crazy to just tell somebody, hey, stack a pallet with all these random boxes. But for a robot, that's a really complex task. And we're building all of these different capabilities, layers of intelligence that can be applied to the robot arms that are now widely available, so that they can do this complicated work.
That's really cool and very exciting, I might add. I do have a question here from Carol I'll bring up really quickly. She would like to know, which specific components of innovation are you most excited about right now? That's a
Uh,
great question, Carol. Thank you for asking.
that is a great question. I think that actually touches on the thing that I was just discussing, which is, when you think about robots as they have been for the last 40 years, robots and automation, it's been what we call open loop, meaning that you tell the robot to do something, and then it just does the thing exactly as you told it to do. So, if you tell the robot to grab this phone, and it knows that the phone is here, it'll be able to grab it. But if you move the phone over here, then it'll try to grab it here and then say, help, I'm stuck, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Well, this next layer of intelligence, the robot can start reacting to the environment. So it says, oh, I think there's supposed to be a phone here, but you know what, it's over here, so I'm going to go grab it and pick it up and move it and do the thing that I'm supposed to be doing with it. That's a very basic example, but innovation and robotics is going from just following orders to responding to their environments. Now, what makes that really exciting is not just the ability to adapt to workflows that are presented to it, but being able to self-optimize. So what that means is, with every pick, our robots, Dexterity, learn something about their environment. They know the size and the weight of the object that they're grabbing, the speed at which they move it. They can scan the barcode and figure out where it's coming from. And all of that information can be collected and then reflected back to the owners, operators, the people on site, to understand what's actually happening in their warehouse. Now, that could derive insights like, oh, I know that this shipping line is always 2 hours late, so I'm going to optimize my production schedule so that I can bring these other things that aren't late forward in my queue, knowing that these things are always later than I always anticipate them to be. But where things get really interesting is when the system itself can start optimizing, where the robot system can know, oh, this thing is always late. And therefore, as I'm building orders for bread delivery, for example, and I know that the tortillas are always later than the hot dog buns, I'm going to stack these hot dog buns first, and then I'll go over to the tortillas once those arrive. So that's type of self-tuning means that the system is, again, not just following orders, but it's responding and adapting to the work environment that they're in. And that not only means we're able to do more complicated work, but also meaning that we're not having to stop production, make people go in and fiddle with robots more often. Like robots can start truly becoming a coworker that's working alongside the people doing these complicated jobs.
Exactly. And just to build on that, this is going to be kind of an ad hoc question here.
Please.
But just to build on that, where do you see the role of interpolarity in all this, and how important is that?
The role of what? Could you
Interpolarity?
interpolarity. So yeah, so you're suggesting that where do people fit into the mix? Is that right?
Right, yes.
Yeah. So within this context, I think a lot of people have expectations for robots that are set by science fiction movies. The video that you just showed really showed the cutting edge of robotics in handling things that you would expect a 5-year-old to be able to handle, which is picking a loaf of bread up from here and placing it over there. And that's really cutting edge for a robot, because robots love to smash bread, but giving them a sense of touch, giving them an understanding of what a loaf of bread is, even when it puffs differently or the plastic is shiny and a little strange to their vision system, understanding where and how to grab it and place it someplace is like the top of the line cutting edge. Within that context, we've seen, countless examples of corner case scenarios where robots are not going to be able to be successful in the near term, where you have a rapid turnover of workflows that need to change on a dime because something dramatically changes in the environment. If you have something that is able to handle 80% of the scenarios, then more likely than not, the robot is able to be a coworker in the space that it's operating. But there's always going to be some level of creativity, problem solving on the ground the day of, where a person is going to need to say, you know what, this is different, and this is different because of X, Y, and Z factor, and I know how to mitigate those factors. So we've often seen in our deployments people interacting with the robots by telling them how to optimize their system. There's some fine tuning that the system will do over time, but inevitably, given the complexity of supply chain and workflows, a person's going to have to be in the mix, giving them higher and higher level commands to figure out what they need to do in order to get the job done.
Excellent. Yeah, sorry. I had to nerd out for a second. So that was a little that was a
No,
little
please.
off of our script, but I'm like, I've got you here.
My pleasure.
Thank you for that. And then Chris S has a question here for us. He says, is it possible that all this emphasis on flexibility or ultimately mimicking the human is cool technology, but ultimately taking the long way around to perform a task? In other words, each and every task is unique and fixed. So why use a mechanism that's basically a Swiss Army knife when you wouldn't use a Swiss Army knife if you were doing just cutting all day long? I mean, that's an interesting perspective, and I definitely want to address it because I think that's in the robotics and automation space, especially when you're going to these greenfield sites or even some of these brownfield sites and you're marketing your technology, you do get a little bit of pushback, and that's kind of an interesting perspective. So what's your take, Michael?
Chris, that's a great question, and it's a fundamental question. So this is really the path that automation has been on for a while, where you have something that's extremely fixed and extremely repeatable. And when you know that, and you can calibrate a system to handle it to a certain level of throughput, then there might be a need for something that's a very defined work cell, as you call a typical robotic automation cell, where you're doing something with millimeter precision. In the supply chain space, you can even design an entire warehouse to be a robot. They call it that an automated storage and retrieval system, where you have these racks that are extremely expensive, extremely complicated to deploy. But when you have a certain volume of throughput and your workflow is not changing, then it makes total sense to deploy these systems, because you know exactly how things are going to be deployed over a long period of time. Where robots haven't been successful is in brownfield sites or brownfield workflows. So what that means is you have a greenfield site that you can't necessarily, you don't have a greenfield site to completely design with automation in mind from the ground up. If you look at most warehousing spaces across the world, they don't have automation for precisely that reason. It's very expensive. It's very time intensive to deploy robotics. And by the way, if the air compressor goes down or your networking is slower than usual and the robot stops working, then your entire system is down because you can't put a person in that workflow to get the job done. So where that flexibility becomes really important is where you have a dynamic environment where you're assuming that to some extent you're going to need to supplement some of the work with people in doing the job, or you require a lot of flexibility. So for example, in parcel delivery, you don't always know the size, weight, shapes, material conditions of the package that's being presented to a person or to a robot. So having a robot that's really flexible and handling those types of materials is very important. But in a lot of precision manufacturing, having something that's incredibly repeatable is important. The last thing I'll say on this, though, which is really interesting, is that this next level of automation that is flexible can start becoming more flexible in the design standards for manufacturing. So if you have something that's really custom or very bespoke, you can start being more responsive to different types of materials that the robot can handle, different sizes and configurations and shapes of things that a robot can build. Whereas traditional robots really need everything finely tuned for one work cell, and they build the same thing at scales of thousands. But what if you could have a robot that can help adapt to some of the changing requests that a customer has, so that they can build on the orders of tens, but multiple batches of tens, rather than having to build at the scale of thousands in order to make financial sense.
That's excellent feedback. And speaking of customized automation, our friend Vlad is here. He wants to know, do you believe that we will reach a point similar to what we saw at Tesla in 2020, where there's so much complexity in the technologies we're deploying that we simply don't have the manpower to properly maintain and support operations, and thus negatively impact the process? This is a good question, Vlad. Thank you for asking.
Yeah. And, candidly, this is one of the biggest challenges in our side of the industry, is not just designing for technology, but designing for human use. And within our space, that's a field called human robot interaction or human machine interaction, where you're trying to think about how somebody can rapidly get up to speed in not just operating a machine, but also being able to service and support it. So designing for repair, field repair, that somebody with a few hours of training can swap out an end effector or the gripper on a robot without having to call the OEM or Dexterity or some system integrator. How to troubleshoot on a localized operating tablet to say, oh, there's something weird here. I can figure out what the problem is, and I can help the robot work through the problem without having to escalate this to the software provider or the integrator that's managing the WMS system. Like, those answers are reflected directly to the person who's operating the machine. So at Dexterity, we've hired a team of UI, UX experts who go into the field and work with the people deploying our system on the ground to say, where are you getting stuck? Where do you not understand what's happening with the robot? How can we signal intention to the robot so that if it's doing something that it's not supposed to do, or it's starting to do something that it's not supposed to do, you can flag it and say, oh, you know what, cancel this order, go build that order someplace else because X, Y, and Z thing in this environment has changed, or the needs of our system have changed. So I think that's a challenge for our industry as a whole, to design systems from the ground up so that everybody, somebody can be trained very quickly to become a proficient robot operator.
Excellent answer. Thank you to Vlad, and thank you, Michael, for that input. That's awesome. I think we have time for one more question today, if that's okay.
Of course.
But I know that you're the VP of marketing, so I did want to ask you a marketing question that I think that my audience could appreciate as well. From this marketing perspective, right? Because usually, when you're getting into robotics, it's all very technical and all of that good stuff. But what do you think the most effective way for companies to position their technology in a way to encourage the adoption of technology is? And would you adopt some of these same strategies when adopting the technology on the shop floor with the frontline workers?
Yeah. I think a lot of this, you talk about marketing, but marketing is only as good as the product itself. And I think when you're doing product discovery and trying to find product market fit, one of the best questions that we can ask our customers or prospects is, what job do you hate? And going to the person who's doing the job on the floor and saying, if you were to wave a magic wand and do one, solve one thing about your job, what can we do to help you solve that problem? And through that process, you start understanding the real pain points that are not just affecting the person, because they affect the person who's on the front line doing that job. Then it has all these knock-on effects across the organization. You have higher churn rates in these jobs, so you're having to spend more time hiring and training. You have less motivation in these jobs, so you're seeing lower throughput, which then means that you have to build all this long tail of buffer, assuming that this one task is slower than everything else, and you're buying up additional inventory so this one piece of the job doesn't get stuck and cause all these knock-on effects down the supply chain. There's all of these different things that can start surfacing from these really painful things that people just don't want to do. An example that somebody told me about was anecdote was, there was a company that was looking to help in the construction manufacturing space, and they were really concerned about the adoption by the construction workers who are on the job. And so they went to them and said, what job do you hate? And they said, I hate measuring the temperature of asphalt. Which, you have this hot mess of asphalt, and it stinks and it's sweaty and it's the summer and it's noxious to breathe in. And you're standing there with a thermometer in this uncomfortable space where you might get burned and breathe some disgusting air. And so they created an automation solution to do that. And as a result, then all of these additional ideas of problems that can be solved surfaced from there. So at Dexterity, we've been looking at things like, you have these slapper lanes where you grab something, you put it on a conveyor belt that ends up at a stacking station where somebody's building a pallet at the end. And our customers are, the people on the ground are saying, I hate doing that job because I'm having to pick something up and stack it 2 meters above my head. I'm having to get in trouble because I'm trying to problem solve on the fly. I'm doing 50 different things at once. And this package of Huggies got more squished than normally. And now people are complaining about all the squished Huggies that are showing up at the retail store. And it just doesn't make me feel good about the work that I do. So you're seeing this constant turnover in this job. And so more and more people are having to rotate in or quitting the job to go do something else. And you have a lot more inexperienced people piling in. And as a result, more stuff gets crushed, and, it's all of these different problems. So from our perspective, we can market it all day long to say, there's X, Y, and Z benefit, and we stack things at 25% more than this rate. But if we're solving a real pain point, a real problem for the customer, that's when there's an aha moment. And that's where the relationship really unlocks so that we can go do something transformative.
Absolutely. That's amazing feedback. And I think there's a lot of value in that response, and especially how you position within not only just your company's products, but to your company's workforce as well. And that's great information. Michael, I think we are over time. I've appreciated this conversation. For anybody that's in the audience that is interested in connecting with you or reaching out to you to learn more about yourself or Dexterity, how do you wish for them to do so?
Yeah, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Michael Patrick Perry. I'm always happy to talk about robots and automation. Even I'm always happy to talk about dexterity and the incredible stuff that we're doing. But I love talking about robots. It's a passion of mine, and been lucky enough to see a lot of stuff that's really cutting edge. Some of it works, some of it's bleeding edge, but the stuff that's working is pretty cool. So feel free to reach out. Always happy to chat.
Awesome. Well, I can say I feel like your passion for the robotics industry definitely shines through.